So let's talk through some of the easiest armies to start Warhammer 40k with the lowest barriers to entry for getting a cool army worth of fun miniatures on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Warspace Tactics, where today we're talking about options for getting into the game, and in this one focusing on the armies that are generally considered to be easier to get into Warhammer 40k with than others. For looking at which armies are easiest to get into Warhammer 40k, it's perhaps worth talking about the challenges that newer players have to learn and do. You have to grasp the core rules of the game and also the faction rules on top of that. Quite a lot of information to take in, particularly with all of Games Workshop's erratas and updates and things, so having a faction with slightly simpler rules maybe doesn't hurt too much. But I'd say in 10th edition, most armies' rules are kind of intuitive, though some are maybe a little bit obvious in the way that they play than others. Otherwise, cost is a big factor as well for many. Obviously, how much of a big deal it is depends on how much money you have for hobbies and fun stuff, and a 1,000-point Warhammer army could often cost in the region of somewhere like $300 to $500 depending on what you go for. Some armies just wind up being cheaper to collect by the way that Games Workshop sells things, and then once you've understood the rules and got the models, you still need to assemble them and paint them to put them on the tabletop. And again, there's certain armies that are just far faster to do that with than others. They aren't going to take quite as much hobby time if that's a limiting factor. In general though, I'd perhaps rate 10th edition as an easier edition to get going compared with some in 40k's past. They've got the core rules freely downloadable, and there's still a fair few factions that basically have free downloadable rules from their indexes, that they go away when the codexes come out, and the faction rules aren't quite as deep as they used to be. One army rule, one detachment, and then datasheet rules, and that's basically all you need. With all that in mind then, for things that make an easier army to get into the game versus others, some armies just tend to hit those criteria a bit better. Obviously you absolutely can start with literally any faction that you like, with the looks, lore, feel or rules of them, and you often get quite a lot of hobby respect for collecting something a bit different, maybe some of the factions that people see on the tabletop a bit less often, partly due to the barriers of access. For what makes an easier starter army though, generally low price with cheaper models or more discount offerings available, or just having miniatures that have a lot of points per the amount of dollars spent are kind of good. For ease of gameplay, certain armies are just a bit easier to grasp than others. In general, perhaps a common factor is that armies that tend to have a bit more high toughness and a bit more staying power compared with others tend to be easier to play. Things like Custodes, Imperial Knights, or even Space Marines in their power armor, at least compared with armies where plenty of their units die to a stiff breeze. Finally, for model requirements, for the painting and modelling side of things, generally if there's fewer miniatures to paint up to make an army of any given size, that can speed things up with getting an army functioning a lot faster, so highly elite armies tend to be quite good for that. Maybe armies like Elite Space Marines or Custodes or Imperial Knights could be good examples. For this video though, I thought we'd talk through 6 examples of armies that are maybe check those criteria off a little bit better than others, and some of their pros and cons in game. Starting out with some Elite Space Marine Demon Hunters, first up we have the Grey Knights, these guys being the secretive Space Marine chapter that's essentially the militant wing of the Order Malleus of the Inquisition, dedicated to rooting out and destroying the demonic wherever it might manifest. Every battle brother an incorruptible psyker, and they fight often in Terminator armor with teleport tactics, using force weapons, incinerators, and perhaps sanctic rituals where necessary to keep the warp spawn on their side of the barrier to the warp. Models wise, they've got a fairly small miniature range that can use a few generic Space Marine toys. They mainly revolve around 3 primary plastic kits, their power armoured one, their Terminators, and the Dread Knight. The miniatures are fairly fun flexible ones that maybe are a bit slightly on the older side for 40k plastics these days. They came about long before the dawn of primary Space Marines, so all firstborn Marines on that kind of scaling. Price-wise, the Grey Knights are easily one of the cheapest armies to play in all of Warhammer 40k. Basically all of their kits get a decent amount of points on the board for the amount of money that you spend, and they've got a particularly useful combat patrol box at the moment. That one contains some Strike Marines, some Terminators, and a Dread Knight, so basically all 3 of their standard plastic kits, all at discount, and you could literally just start an army by taking 2 or 3 of those combat patrol boxes, and you genuinely have quite a strong army to get going with. It helps that plenty of those kits can be assembled in different ways as well. Say fielding these Strike Marines as Interceptors or Purifiers or something. For getting models on the tabletop, again they're probably one of the easier ones out there. The majority of the Grey Knight colour scheme is kind of monochromatic silver. There's loads of ways that you can make that look very fancy indeed, but also it can be as simple as spraying the model silver and applying some washes and a few highlights perhaps, and you can get them looking very nice. Then picking out some shiny force weapons and a few other details. They're really quite an elite army as well, so you don't tend to have to paint absolutely masses of miniatures on the board, which can also be helpful to reduce the painting burden a bit. In game, their 10th edition rules shook up their formula a fair bit, really very heavily focusing on their teleport tactics, and as a result, a lot of their unit profiles maybe aren't the absolute strongest when they go toe to toe with the enemy, but generally have fun teleport movement shenanigans to be able to get the jump on the enemy, though it does mean that you need to absolutely utilise those in the best way possible, otherwise you might be fighting on the back foot if you just literally stomp things into combat and battle. As a result, they may be a little bit trickier to play than they might have been at some points in the past, at least for someone who's super new to 40k's movement shenanigans and things, but perhaps not so bad that it should seriously put people off. For possible drawbacks for collecting a Grey Knight army, I feel like maybe the biggest one is that they have the potential for a big 40k range update at some point. Games Workshop seem to have been going through the different chapters out there and making them Primaris scale. At some point it seems likely that the Grey Knights have this happen to them, a big release with at least their Terminators and Strike Marines updated to Primaris scale, and that could mean that a bunch of other models maybe don't translate perfectly to the new style Grey Knights, and I feel like that is one thing that might make people apprehensive to go really big investment on them right now. The annoying thing is that could be this edition, it could be a really long way in the future, we just don't know at this point. In any case though, if I were jumping into Grey Knights, I'd start with their Combat Patrol box set. It has all three of their main kits as you can see here, plus a Terminator Librarian which is handy enough to throw around some mortal wounds in game too. I'd probably literally start with one or two of those and then build out from there. Before we move on, I thought I'd just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Titan's Terrain, which could be one option for one of the easiest ways to get a gaming board of terrain set up for Warhammer 40k. One other challenge when you break into the game. There's plenty of good terrain options out there, and this one does things differently to most, having a system of basically fold out cardboard terrain, where you have a bunch of tiles that make up a game board, each one of which basically deploys a building of one sort or another, and then they all fold completely flat, and then store in a box set that's basically the same sort of size as a standard board game, which you can't do with most terrain out there. There's definitely pros and cons to it, and I'll cycle back to it at the end of the video if you're interested. The main advantages being a fair bit cheaper than Games Workshop bought terrain. It's very portable due to folding flat and doesn't require any hobby effort at all to put it on the table, so it could be a helpful choice for some. I'll leave it links down in the video description and talk about their range a little bit more fully at the end of the video. Next up, and super relevant for 10th edition 40k, we have the Tyranids, Xenos swarms from beyond the galaxy, all consuming hive fleets that devour everything in their path and then move on. These disturbing carapace space bugs keep on evolving and adapting with new bioforms specialised to all manner of different battlefield roles, and fight as a great synaptically controlled swarm, node relay organisms controlling the lesser ones. Miniatures wise, they're one of 40k's more established factions. Their miniature range I'd say is kind of medium aged with Warhammer 40k, but they've been the lucky recipients of a whole bunch of new unupdated stuff in 10th edition. Loads of their older stuff got nice new miniatures, and they got plenty of other goodies besides. Quite a lot of new and exciting stuff to attract people to the faction. As a result of their 10th edition release, they're one of the cheaper armies to get into at the moment. Basically being the big antagonist faction of 10th edition meant that they've starred in the Leviathan box set, the starter sets, and will also have some deals from that Combat Patrol magazine that's been coming out. At least for getting a lot of plastic and points on the board fairly cheaply, the Tyranids can do that quite well at the moment. And loads of the units that either featured in Leviathan or the starter sets go for really quite cheap second hand, and are likely to do so for a while to come. That's true of say these Von Ryan's Leapers, which appear in the Tyranids starter sets and Leviathan. When they're sold on places like eBay, they tend to go far lower than the actual Games Workshop price due to the presence of all of those discount deals. For getting miniatures on the tabletop, again I'd say that Tyranids are one of the easiest armies out there to do so. Typically the vast majority of Tyranid models are made up of either their sort of fleshy skin sort of colour or their carapace colour, so you can see the purple and bone colour of Leviathan for this Tyran effect here. They're both very amenable to being done by contrast paints or dry brushes if you do want to get a lot of bugs on the board very quickly. And in terms of model number requirements, I'd say it's a bit more than a few of the other armies I'll mention on this list. I feel like that is partly in your control though. You can go for very swarmy Tyranid builds where you're putting hundreds of termagants on the tabletop, but you can absolutely very viably play Monster Mash Tyranids and focus on a few of the bigger critters. In game at the moment they've got a fair bit of versatility. Most competitive lists tend to take a bit of a mix of range and melee stuff, though you can definitely skew to one or the other at the moment. I've got multiple detachments that work pretty well, either going for things like sneaky tricks of the Vanguard Onslaught or the power of the Invasion Fleet, and you can make Swarm builds work as well, even if they did lose a bit of power in optimised play when the Unending Swarm got nerfed. For potential drawbacks, as they have really quite a lot of units and options, it can be a good thing for building armies your way, but it does mean there might be quite a big difference between, say, a basic starter list and what's considered more optimized and strong for the Tyranids right now. It's maybe kind of easy to get a lot of models on the tabletop with starter set things, but they might need a bit of support for things to take down, say, heavy monsters and vehicles, which those units can't do quite so well. For starting Tyranids currently though, I'd likely try and acquire the Tyranid half of the Leviathan box, if you can find somewhere that's selling it for a reasonable price, or otherwise probably a box half of either the starter or ultimate starter sets. If you can find a Space Marine player to split that with, then it's just an unusually good deal for 40k miniatures, essentially 5 different units for the sort of price that Games Workshop might often sell one for. Moving on, let's talk about the poster boys of Warhammer 40k themselves. In general, Space Marines always tend to be one of the easiest armies to break into the game with. Basically the poster boys of the setting, genetically augmented super soldiers in ceramite power armor, wielding their iconic bolters, and all manner of fancy power weapons and various specialist infantry types, and make war in their own chapters with their bright heraldry and unique fighting styles with their strengths and flaws. Miniature-wise, they always tend to be the best supported range of models in Warhammer 40k, an absolutely huge range both of newer primaries and older firstborn miniatures at the moment. Games Workshop has been releasing Space Marine models at kind of breakneck speed over the past few editions, with the general aim of updating their range from the previous more standard firstborn models to new chunky primaries at their slightly bigger scaling. Price-wise, Space Marines are always one of the easier armies to get miniatures on the board at a slightly more reasonable cost than most. Pretty much all of their units tend to be at least fairly elite, which is generally a good thing in terms of converting money to points in an army of any given size. Plus they have more discount options than at basically any other army, several combat patrols that can be more useful to a broader army. Plus, as with the Tyranids 40k starter sets, including their half of the Leviathan box sets and the regular starter sets that are on sale from Games Workshop, in particular, any of their 10 model boxes tend to be quite strong ones for getting lots of points on the board. And more so than any other faction, they also tend to have an absolutely huge second-hand market. It's not too hard to find people reselling Space Marine armies all over the place due to the popularity of the faction. It just gives you a chance to get some really good deals there if you're willing to repaint some models. In terms of making and painting them up, again they tend to be more elite than most, though it might vary a bit depending on exactly what sort of Space Marine army you go for. I'd argue that painting them up doesn't tend to be the hardest challenge in 40k. They're generally quite armoured, so it's mainly about blocking in big patches of colour. Though there's definitely either easier or harder ways to do that. It's going to take a lot more time if you edge highlight everything, for example. In-game, Space Marines have a reputation for being a little bit more forgiving than some factions. They all fight in power armour, so at least are fairly durable, and even the least threatening Space Marine can still punch a bunch of light infantry into the dirt, so maybe not quite as punishing as some armies out there if you make some decisions slightly wrong. And Space Marines with their enormous model range can play in multiple different playstyles, so you could be making different Space Marine armies, fighting with different detachment rules and using entirely separate units to each other, really allowing you to tailor it to your preferences or playstyle. Some things certainly are stronger than each other though in-game. As with the Tyranids, their vast range can be a downside as well as a positive. It means that the average player very rarely has the absolute optimal Space Marine competitive list ready to go, and when things get changed around, a strong Space Marine army could look entirely different to the one that you just collected. It does mean that you really can't afford to chase the meta too hard. It just makes more sense to build up a fairly balanced collection, adding things as you feel like them and not going down just buying a tournament list or something. As with the Grey Knights as well, a large chunk of their range are firstborn models and kind of likely to get either updated, replaced, or just removed over time. I'd say it generally makes sense to stick to more of the new Primaris sculpts if you want them to be future-proofed, though it can be kind of annoying for certain chapters out there, particularly when there's a lot of their unique units in older firstborn miniature format, say Space Wolves and Dark Angels units in particular. For getting into Space Marines as a bit more of a balanced kind of start though. As with the Tyranids, if you can land one of the halves of the Leviathan box at a reasonable price, I think that's a pretty good way to get into them. Otherwise probably go with one of the discount options on sale from Games Workshop, maybe one of the halves of the starter sets, perhaps the Vanguard Task Force if you like some Phobos, the Dark Angels Combat Patrol has got some okay infantry, and maybe just for newer players jumping in, things like Hellblasters and Terminators can be fairly good options. Very cheap for the amount of points that you get on the board and fairly general purpose damage dealers, even if they don't appear in too many optimised tournament lists. Next up, moving on, we have the Necrons, the ancient and deathless race of living metal Xenos, swapping their weak flesh for biomechanical bodies a long time ago at the cost of every one of their souls. They went into stasis in their tomb worlds long ago, and now they're arising once more to reclaim the galaxy and take back what was rightfully theirs. Miniatures wise, they're now one of 40k's more developed factions again, getting a whole bunch of new and rather nice looking plastic miniatures in their big release around the Adeptus box in 9th edition, which made Necrons really quite a popular faction with a whole load of people collecting them. Price wise, Necrons aren't quite as cheap to collect as they used to be. In 9th edition they had a whole load of options for discount deals, now it's mainly the Combat Patrol and whatever you can find going cheaper online. It is well worth checking out eBay and local gaming shops for potential discounts though. Between Indomitus, the Imperial magazine, and the previous 40k starter sets, there's a lot of units that got sold at discounted rates, and it often means that you might be able to find certain things a bit cheaper, say things like Scorpec Destroyers and Necron Warriors. For getting miniatures on the tabletop, Necrons in general again are a bit more forgiving than most here, particularly if you go for things like their more classic Sotek colour scheme. It can be as simple as spray them all silver, give them a nice wash of Nuln oil, and pick out some cool glowy details, and you can have an army that looks really quite effective on the tabletop already. Super quick if time or effort is limited on the painting side, though of course there's also loads of room for making them feel very fancy indeed as well. Gameplay wise, Necron's core mechanics tend to focus around durability and resilience, kind of classically. Their core rule is reanimation protocols, allowing units to regrow wounds over the course of the game, easy enough to use and a little bit disruptive for the opponent's target priority. In current 10th edition, the strongest Necron army lists out there can often look a little bit weird, with things like Hypercrypt Legion shenanigans doing Grey Knight style teleporting, but there's plenty of scope for doing well with something a bit more standard looking. Awakened Dynasty is also a strong detachment. They've certainly got plenty of units that add a bunch of raw danger though. Catan in particular are big, tough, and very simple to use well, just marching up the board, shrugging off damage and destroying enemy heavy hitters. And Necrons have got quite a lot of scary firepower units, things like Locust Heavy Destroyers or Doomsday Arcs potentially, which can be really quite simple and effective to blast away at the enemy army in-game. For downsides collecting Necrons, as mentioned, they're not quite as cheap as they used to be. They had a bunch of discount deals removed from 10th edition, so aren't as cheap as they were. I'd also say that at time of recording, their internal codex balance isn't particularly great. A bunch of kind of classic units like Necron Warriors, Triarch Praetorians, and some of their vehicles really feel quite underpowered versus the good stuff. Though admittedly it's probably not the biggest thing to get too hung up on. 40k rules do change kind of regularly, and any 1 points update could really turn that around. At the moment I'd probably be most tempted to pick up the Combat Patrol for Necrons, or try and seek out some deals on second-hand miniatures to get the core of a force together, and then build out from there, maybe adding some danger units like Catan or some heavy firepower. As ever, if you are looking to pick up any new 40k kits at all, I bear in mind that it tends to be cheaper either online retailers or friendly local gaming stores. They sell the same things as the Games Workshop Warhammer web store, but do so at a discount. I've got lots of examples of those links down in the video description below, anywhere between 10 and 20% off depending on where you are in the world. If you are looking to pick stuff up, feel free to check those out down in the video description. They do help to support Auspex Tactics a little bit if you choose to buy anything through them. To take a look at our last two armies though, next up we have the Adeptus Custodes. I think out of any of them, these might be one of the ones I'd rate as perhaps one of the single easiest to get into Warhammer 40k. Just checking off all the low barrier of entry criteria, while also having more recent miniatures that don't feel like they're under quite as much threat as the Grey Knights. The Custodes are the golden guardians of the Emperor and Holy Terror itself. Every warrior essentially equivalent to a champion or hero of other factions out there, massively stronger and tougher than Space Marines, and fighting with some of the best war gear the Imperium has to offer, fancy Auramite armour, and awesome technological relics such as Guardian Spears and Imperial jet bikes. All this comes at a price of course, and they'll almost always be outnumbered by their foes. Miniature-wise, they've got a pretty small but nicely done recent plastic range. Fairly cool miniatures in my opinion, with a whole bunch of snazzy details, with engraved eagles and thunderbolts and things, and big chunky oversized power weapons. Pricing-wise, they're perhaps the single cheapest army to get into Warhammer 40k with. Basically every single one of their kits has pretty huge points per dollar, given that their basic infantry are 45 points each, and their Terminators are 65, and it means that any of their standard infantry things tend to be good deals to get you towards any size of army. And then their Combat Patrol is a particularly standout one, far better than most in 10th edition. It's around 750 points, just literally using the miniatures out of the box, and you can potentially use some as shield captains as well. Any of their past other discount deals or Battle Force sets tend to be pretty good as well. In terms of getting models on the table, again they're one of the armies that's got a more simplistic colour scheme. Classically they're fielded in gold, though you can do other schemes if you'd like to. Lots can be done with some basic dry brushing and washing, maybe over a spray of some Retributor armour if you wanted. They're also perhaps one of the most elite armies in Warhammer 40k, meaning that say a 2000 point army could literally be something like 20 to 30 models, and tend to be probably the fastest 40k army that you could speed paint, maybe vying a little bit with Imperial Knights perhaps. Gameplay wise, they're kind of a hard faction to go too far wrong with. They've got high toughness and elite melee, basically meaning that their normal game plan is stomping towards the middle of the board and daring the enemy to come and fight them for it. Lots of armies at a more casual level can struggle to deal with them, and they tend to be particularly good against Space Marines with their weapon damage profiles, lots of AP and damage too. For downsides, while their small range does mean that you can have most of their options painted up quite quickly, it does mean that they sort of feel a little bit like half an army unless you dip into their more expensive Forge World style of things, like say this Caladius Grav Tank. If you want to use those sort of units, it's either finding 3D printed proxies for them, or paying really quite a lot of money for the official Games Workshop stuff, or just hoping that they'll do a range refresh for them at some point, sooner rather than later. It does seem like it's odds on to happen at some stage for Heresy. They can also maybe be a bit more simplistic to play with, often being a bit of a stat check army that tend to win games with pure might, maybe feeling like a bit of a power trip, but might not always be the most interesting foe to face for your opponent. In any case, to get started with them, that Combat Patrol Adeptus Custodes is pretty excellent overall. A good balance of 3 of their 5 primary plastic kits, or maybe just a box of Custodian Guard if you want to have some miniatures to paint up. Again, that's very reasonable in terms of points per money. Finally, for a look at 6 main factions, there's the Imperial or Chaos Knights, perhaps one of the armies in Warhammer 40k that operate the most differently, an army of nobles and super heavy vehicles, big stompy robots marching into battle, with various patterns of war gear, melee, and massive firepower, either crusading and noble Imperial Knights taking down the enemies of the Emperor, or dread renegades sworn to the ruinous powers, often making questionable pacts with demons to spread dread and despair wherever they go. Miniatures wise, the Imperial and Chaos Knights are both fairly recent 40k factions as they go. Their kit's nice modern ones by Games Workshop standards that have often been expanded in various different ways. They don't have the biggest amount of box sets in their range, but the ones that they do have are pretty flexible, each one of them making at least 2 knight variants, if not far more. Price-wise, collecting Knights or Chaos Knights is never going to be the most expensive army out there. They don't generally tend to have discount box sets besides the occasional special release, but literally every one of them from the plastic range is fairly decent points per dollar on the tabletop. Plus you only need a few slightly huge models to make an army, which often saves in the long run. I think more than most factions out there though, by the time you've got a 2000 point army worth of knights, you'll already have built up at least one copy of a lot of units in the codex, as opposed to say Space Marines where you could just literally keep expanding the army into the ridiculously distant future and still probably not have a copy of literally every single one of each flavour of Space Marine you can field. For getting models on the tabletop, just a few miniatures does have its advantages. Obviously each one is a bigger project than say infantry models out there, but once you've got a process established for knights, in terms of time invested for points on the board, they're pretty efficient, and you can get a lot of legwork done by leaving off the armour panels, spraying the undersuit, say silver or metallic coloured, and then spraying the panels your primary faction colour. Then you've already got the base colours down, and you just need to add some details. If you're up for a little bit more of a painting and modelling challenge, I'd certainly recommend investing in magnets as well. There's lots of good tutorials out there on YouTube. In the long run, the time investment of those is massively worth it. I say it could mean that you could field every single Armiger or War Dog as a different pattern of them if you wanted, and when you've made one magnetised Questoris and painted up the weapon options, it basically means that you can field about half the datasheets in the codex, and makes them really good at being proof against the changes of different editions. In gameplay terms, I think the Imperial and Chaos Knights have a bit of similarity with the Custodes. They're big stompy walkers that just tend to win a lot of games with pure damage and defense. If the enemy hasn't bought enough anti-tank to deal with them, they're probably in for a bad time. They're just quite easy to use with every model being a fairly big threat, and that can help focus your thinking around decision making as well. Just really get the decisions right for just a few big models on the tabletop. For drawbacks, I'd say perhaps the biggest one to Knights is that the gaming experience can be a little bit different to most armies in Warhammer 40k. It basically means that every game that you're playing, you're sort of playing big stompy monsters and vehicles, which maybe doesn't lend itself to the absolute most varied gameplay. I'd say the majority of players that I know that have Knights armies also tend to have a second army on the go at the same time, just for a bit of mixing up gameplay. If you wanted to get going with a knightly force though, probably the first purchases would be a standard Questoris Knights or the Abominant Desecrator kit for the Chaos, and probably one box of either Armigers or War Dogs. It might make sense to build up the War Dog and Armigers first to perhaps work out a colour scheme on a model that's a little bit less huge and critical. In any case though, beyond just these ones mentioned, there's plenty of other things that have their pros and cons for getting into 40k. I'd say that literally every other flavour of Space Marine has at least some positives. They all tend to be at least fairly elite in terms of money to models and points on the table. Though the Chaos Marines like Thousand Suns, Standard Chaos Marines and World Eaters all have quite a lot of trim that can take a lot of time and effort if you want to have them looking like the box art. Thousand Suns out of these tend to be particularly good in terms of points per money on the tabletop, that maybe aren't quite as friendly in certain other ways, also taking more effort to paint and maybe a little bit less intuitive to completely play right on the tabletop, even if at time of recording they've currently got a lot of in-game power. I feel like Dark Angels might be worth a specific shout out as well, particularly going heavy on the Deathwing and Deathwing Knights and things. Deathwing Knights in particular tends to have similar sort of advantages to things like Custodes, lots and lots of points on the models and just very easy to use, massively tanky Terminators with good melee threat, and I might be tempted to throw in a mention for Orcs as well. If you're going down the pure Games Workshop route, they often can be kind of expensive, but more than most armies out there, they can be an army that lots of people enjoy making kit bashes for. Making your own scrap creations can definitely take the edge off what would otherwise be a pricey army to collect for many. In any case though, I'd be interested to hear your guys' takes on it. Which armies do you feel like are the easiest ones to get into Warhammer 40k right now, and which ones would you most avoid recommending to newer players? Finally, as I said earlier, I'll now cycle back to Titan's Terrain, sponsor of today's video, and just talk through a little bit more about their terrain system with its foldable cardboard for an instant pop-up battlefield. For the main pros and cons for it, as mentioned, the biggest advantages are that it's really easy to store. Basically, you can fold those tiles flat and put them in a box that's the same sort of size as a standard board game, which compared with almost all other Warhammer 40k terrain out there, it's usually going to take far more space than that. Otherwise, it is far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop plastic terrain, at least somewhat comparable to things like MDF and certain cheaper 3D printed offerings. It's definitely economical to put terrain on the tabletop. And for those who want to preserve their hobby time and effort for their miniatures, it doesn't need painting and assembly, so ready to go immediately, and that's one advantage over a lot of other terrain pieces out there. Obviously, each terrain system comes with its pros and cons though. This one is made of cardboard, so it's a little bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF, and can sometimes be a bit hard to perch models on the buildings and things due to it all being designed to fold flat. The grid layout does have its positives, but also means it's a little bit less flexible than some. It doesn't make tournament-approved terrain layouts if that's what you're looking for, and maybe does have a tendency to create a few quite long lines of sight on a board. I'd be most tempted to maybe just add a couple more bits of maybe scattered ruins to a board to break up those lines of sight, so just have a small hybrid approach. I feel like that improves it quite a bit. In any case, for their terrain sets on offer, they've got 3 different ones. This Forgotten Furnace one is basically an industrial, a slightly heretical looking one, lots of glowing runes and foundries and things there. The price for these is £112, $140 or €130, links down in the video description, and it basically gets you this board that's the right size for 2,000 point games. Otherwise, there's this one which is a Shattered Hive, basically a bit more of a standard ruined city sort of vibe on this one, bombed out ruins and storage containers and things. And then finally this one's an overgrown capital one, a bit more of a verdant ancient ruins sort of vibe. This one maybe being a bit more appropriate for use both in the 41st millennium or maybe in a fantasy kind of setting as well. Each of these ones also does have the option for an upgraded centerpiece couple of tiles as well, that cost a little bit extra on the previous prices. The ruined terrain and the ancient ruins ones both have a different flavour of this ruined cathedral sort of building. And the foundry has got this rather big and impressive infernal spire, a big and heretical looking central spire there. In any case, could be a helpful terrain option for a few of you out there. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you want to have a look at their options and stuff, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts on the 40k starter armies down in the comments below. Which ones would you recommend most to newer players getting into the game? Finally, feel free to check out all the links down in the video description if you'd like to help support the channel. There's the Patreon page to see certain videos early, and a few other things like names in the credits and things. plus all the discount links as mentioned earlier to get Warhammer 40k kits a bit less than through Games Workshop's own web store. A massive thank you to anyone using those. In any case though, I'll leave this one here. A massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.